2015. You can see what's happening right now.
And the police retreated for about an hour, moved to the perimeter, and allowed demonstrators to pretty much go at each other. Thousands of protesters gathered there, got pretty violent. They were lobbing water bottles at one another. They were dispensing tear gas. And by they, I mean the demonstrators, not the police. They were also dispensing pepper spray and knocking over some of the trash cans and newspaper dispensers in the park.
What does this symbol mean to you? For some Americans, it represents a noble movement in which their ancestors raised arms and fought for states' rights as the Confederacy.
The history of that flag has so much to do with the Southern heritage, not slavery.
For others, it symbolizes centuries of oppression and racism against minority groups in America, specifically Black Americans.
It was used as a badge of intimidation, a badge of fear, a badge of white superiority, and a badge of death and destruction.
For others still, it is actually a part of their state flag. One thing is clear, however, the history of the symbol is complicated and contested. Though some Americans support the preservation of Confederate imagery as a part of their history and heritage, this particular symbol is frequently conflated with the Confederacy when it should not be. Contrary to popular belief, this symbol was not the original flag of the Confederacy. It was instead the battle flag of a specific regiment. And after the end of the Civil War, the symbol was sparsely used in the following decades besides honoring some veterans. Instead, what many people now associate with this Confederate flag begins with its use in the 1940s.
But for the most part, the battle flag itself was not prominently in use as a political symbol until 1948, more than 80 years after the war ended, when it resurfaced for a very specific reason. In opposition to Harry Truman's efforts to provide equality for African Americans, which included desegregation of the armed forces.
In opposition to Truman, segregationist Democrats in the South embraced this Confederate emblem. It was during the same time that the third and modern incarnation of the Ku Klux Klan began using the symbol for violent acts of hatred. Similarly, the majority of memorializations of Confederate icons coincide not after the end of the Civil War, but years later with the rise of the segregated and cruel Jim Crow laws. Proof that the intended purpose of these symbols was not to celebrate these figures, however controversial they may be, but rather to intimidate.
About a century after the end of the Civil War, the U.S. experienced a surge of civil rights protests in the 1960s that swept the nation. In opposition to the African American community, new organizations started to emerge, most prevalently the modern Ku Klux Klan, who adopted the Confederate symbolism as a part of their movement. This has since solidified the creation of the anti-minority, anti-black culture that many people associate Confederatism with today. For example, one of the most important events that has sparked a rebirth in the controversial debate surrounding the Confederate flag and monuments happened in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. This event was organized by white supremacists and neo-Nazis and was called the Unite the Right Rally. Here, alt-right protesters and counter-protesters clashed in a bloody and violent confrontation, ending in 3 casualties and numerous injuries. Since Charlottesville, Confederate symbolism in the U.S. has been widely debated upon, with Confederate statues being torn down and vandalized, and flags being burned and destroyed. Most recently, students at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill pulled down Silent Sam, which was a Confederate statue on their college campus. Protesters used ropes to pull down the statue after first covering it with banners, one of which said that it was time for a world without white supremacy. When the statue fell, people cheered, kicked, screamed, and vandalized the statue. With these inflammatory and controversial events occupying the American news cycle, many people have taken both moderate and extreme stances.
As these controversial events unfold, 2 extreme sides of the debate have formed, with very different ideas regarding Confederate symbolism. On one side, there are those who support removing or destroying the monuments. This side of the debate sees the symbolism as racist, believing that it celebrates slavery. They find it offensive that these Confederate figures and their consequent implications are displayed in public.
And in the second decade of the 21st century, asking African Americans, or anyone else for that matter, to drive by property that they own, occupied by reverential statues of men who fought to destroy the country and deny that person's humanity seems perverse.
By this statue, it becomes very painful when I think of the suffering that my ancestors went through. They enslaved people, abused people for their own economic impact, and it should not be celebrated by these statues.
Confederate symbolism has also been regarded by this side as anti-American, as it represents the South's secession from the country.
Here, we do celebrate, I don't think any other city out there, any other country or in the world celebrates another army taking up arms against its actual country, except here in the South.
The other side of the debate supports Confederate symbolism, believing it represents Southern pride. They argue that it celebrates the war itself, a war they claim was fought for states' rights. Many people also believe the symbolism represents those who fought and died in the war, many of which are their ancestors.
It's no different from honoring veterans of the Iraqi War, Korean War, Vietnam War. This is honoring the veterans.
Those on this side of the debate, including President Trump, oppose the removal of this symbolism, claiming that it destroys the history and culture of our country.
While the two extremities on the stances of Confederate symbolism exist, there is a more rational, moderate side as well. Many of these people feel that while something should be done to prevent bystanders from feeling attacked by these symbols of the Confederacy, the historical importance that many of these pieces present should be preserved, in an effort to inform Americans on the mistakes of the past and continue the historical discussion. A prime example of this moderate stance on the situation was presented in 2015 on the grounds of the University of Texas. After facing complaints from much of the student body on both extremity sides, they rationed the best decision would be to relocate their 8-foot-tall, 2,000-pound statue of Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy, to the History Center. It stands there still today to present a piece of American history and give historical context on the history of the Confederacy. While the future of this controversy is unknown, it is to be expected to have many more public outbreaks and possible violent confrontations if nothing is done to these powerful pieces of history. Communities within the nation must reach a middle ground on the stance to prevent further violent incidents, whether it be preserving them in historical context with an awareness of its tragic history or a complete removal of the monuments and symbols today. There is a common theme. People are demanding change. The U.S. can no longer leave these monuments and flags high without acknowledgement or action of the horrific history associated with the Confederate symbols.
Is there a way to view those monuments that's not viewed as racist?
I mean, well, clearly there are, because there are people who don't view them as racist. They view them as symbols of virtue. They view them as a memorial to a sacrifice that people made for their homes. I mean, clearly that's a part of the narrative. They do tell us a lot of interesting stories if we're willing to hear them. Nobody's talking about being politically correct. Nobody's talking about being, what's the other one I hear? You know, you're being revisionist. No. History is always a process of new questions. Every generation asks a new question, and as scholars, we go back and look at what the historical record left us to try to answer them. And we would be irresponsible if with these new questions that we did not go back and say, hey, now we understand this thing in a bigger way.